Okay, so today we are going to investigate European colonies. We're going to look at English, Spanish, Portuguese, and Dutch people who end up going to the Americas, that's North and South America, and to Southeast Asia, that is near the south part of China, the Philippines, Dutch Java and Sumatra, the islands below China. And the time frame that we're looking at is 1450 through 1750 of the Common Era. These are our learning outcomes for the first part of Unit 3. And then the other parts, assessing early modern globalization and the slave trade and examining primary sources on slavery, we will do that another time. Our focus question is for the second and third parts of Unit 3, so we're going to skip this for now. As always, the IDs and the map IDs and the timeline IDs are at the beginning of the PowerPoint, so you can always reference this list. Okay, so European empires in the Americas. Before Europeans take over and are completely powerful in the Americas, that is North and South America, including Mesoamerica, Middle America, where the Aztec Empire is, there is something called the Great Dying. We have 60 to 80 million people, Native American people, and these numbers are approximate. We don't have census people walking around asking how many people do you have in your household at this time, but we do know that the approximate numbers are 60 to 80 million people. And these people do not have immunities. They are not immune to the diseases that come in from the quote-unquote old world. The old world is Europe and Africa and Asia, and that is also known as the Eastern Hemisphere. The New World, or the Western Hemisphere, includes North and South America. So these old world diseases coming from Europe and Africa and Asia include smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, malaria, and yellow fever. And the people in the New World, in the Western Hemisphere, in North and South America, do not have any immunities. They have never been exposed to the microbes of these diseases, and therefore, when they do contract them, they end up dying in extraordinarily high numbers and very quickly. And it's a very painful, challenging experience, not just physical, where over 90% of the Native Americans end up dying of this, but it's also psychological. There is an explanation that their gods are failing them or aren't strong enough or aren't as strong as the European God, who of course is Jesus. And so it's not just a physical challenge where people get weak and die and the population erodes in a tremendous way, but it's definitely psychological as well, because it's scary when everyone around you is dying and you see these new white people coming here from Europe who aren't dying. They're just sort of suffering through it a little bit and then they heal and get better. Whereas all of us, all of the Native American people, we are all dying and we can't figure out why. And of course, at this time, we don't understand things like diseases and antigens and microbes and how diseases work and how washing your hands is necessary, and etc. And we don't have medicine. So this is a really important experience that these people have. So settler colonies in the Americas. These are colonial societies or colonists from places like Spain and Portugal who control land and labor in the Americas, on the land in the Americas. They start out wealthier because they're wealthier countries in Europe, and they become wealthier even more so once they reach the Americas, because they are able to exact tribute and taxes and forced labor from the local native indigenous population. They also bring Catholicism, Catholic pomp and ceremony, where there are great processions, and it's very showy and very attractive in a lot of ways, and almost scary as well, because it shows how powerful they are. Clearly their God is the correct God because they have so much power, so much wealth, and only righteous people would attain these things. So in a sense, it becomes easier for the Spanish and the Portuguese to rule over their colonies in the Americas because of this. And they end up creating more colonies than other European entities in the early years at least, probably because, again, they start out as wealthier and as more powerful and have a lot of influence in the Americas. In Spanish America, this includes the Aztec territory in Mesoamerica, Middle America, which is now Mexico, and the Incan territory, which is in modern-day Peru-ish region around the Andes Mountains in South America. They establish a few means of controlling the people in the land: an encomienda, a repartimiento, and a hacienda. And these are all settler-controlled territories that are very, very abusive towards the local indigenous population. They start out as so repulsively brutal that the Spanish monarchy ends up sending in influences, and they end up becoming more part of the system and have more influence and control. But the systems, all three of them, are still very, very abusive towards the indigenous people. The hacienda system at the end is basically a large plantation owned by one settler family, and the indigenous locals, the natives of the Americas, of South America, Mesoamerica, end up having to work for what are called peons, or very small amounts of money, basically slave labor in a sense. And their ability to improve their lives is extremely, extremely limited. Creoles are people of Spanish descent born in the Americas. So a Creole is someone who is born here, but their parents are from Spain. And they are kind of second on the social hierarchy ranking. Peninsulares are the highest rank people, and they are Spanish blood people born in Spain, in Europe. And both the Creoles and the Peninsulares have what is called purity of blood. They are pure blood because they don't mix with anyone else. They are purely Spanish and from Spain in Europe, and they are the highest ranking in the social hierarchy. Then we have mestizos. These are mixed races, people who are of local Native American indigenous background, who perhaps breed with Spanish people from Spain. And I say breed because in general, people who are not purely Spanish blood are so low on the social hierarchy, on the racial hierarchy, that they almost aren't even considered real people, real humans. And castas is that racial hierarchy. And it just goes to show how there are racial and social hierarchies everywhere in the world at this time, but here, if someone is a Native American or an Indian, as they were called for many, many years, an indigenous person, they are the lowest ranking people. Eventually, so many of these people end up dying out that Africans are brought in, and that is another social level on this racial hierarchy, very low on the spectrum, as would be expected if you know your history at all. And then in Portuguese Brazil and in Portuguese Caribbean island region, which is sort of south of Florida, to put it in simple terms, they have mostly new African slaves. And there are a lot of them. Millions of Africans are brought into the Caribbean region and into Brazil, which is in South America. And they're new because their numbers constantly need to be replenished because they are constantly dying, because the slave labor conditions are so terrible that such high numbers of them end up dying so often that new slaves for 300 years keep having to be brought in. And then the other word that we can use for people who are low ranking in the Brazilian and Caribbean region under Portuguese control are mulattoes. And a mulatto is a mixed race person. And similar to Spanish America, the darker you get, the more mixed race you are, the lower rank. So a Portuguese person from Portugal would be the highest ranking in the social hierarchy, and Africans and natives from the Americas, from Brazil and from the Caribbean, would be lowest on the totem pole. And these people are working in sugar plantations. Sugar is brought to Europe from Muslims who end up sweetening things like tea and coffee and chocolate. All of a sudden, Europeans become crazy addicted to sugar because it's delicious. But sugar plantations are very challenging and a lot of intensive labor to grow sugar and process sugar. And Europeans are, generally speaking, lazy and don't want to do the work themselves. And so many natives end up dying that Africans need to be brought in to work on these plantations. The Portuguese have a monopoly for over 100 years, and then other European nations come in and start growing sugar as well, including the French, Dutch, and British. Okay, in North America, there are settler colonies. In Britain, there are internal conflicts. There are kings that fight against nobility. Is a rising merchant class. And when merchants who are lower and middle class end up rising with money, money brings them power, and that's a problem for the nobility. People who are nobles and kings don't want to compete socially or politically or in any sort of way, really, with lower classes. So when the merchants end up coming into power, this creates a social tension. So that, in addition to religious challenges between Christian sects, right around this time we have the Protestant Reformation starting in 1517, which we'll talk about later. But this creates a lot of conflict within Europe between Catholics and Protestants and lots of other different sects of Christianity. In the colonies in North America, there's a lot of freedom. So the New England colonies, we call it New England because it's a new branch of Britain, a new branch of England. And there is what is considered to be class equality. Class equality because families come with their wives and maybe a few of their sons. They set up a fence around a territory and then they work the land themselves. Their names that were used in Europe, like Sir, aren't used in North America. And so families who normally would be considered maybe lower class in Britain are now considered equals in the New England colonies. There is not gender equality. It is very patriarchal. Women are expected to stay in the home. They do not have political say at all. They are not allowed to own property. And this causes problems later on when we have, for example, widows who don't have sons, and they end up obtaining land that used to be a man's land, and women aren't allowed to own land. So a lot of these women end up being accused of being witches so that they can be killed and their land can be given to proper people, including men. These white settler societies are also considered purely white because they do not mix with the indigenous population. Part of that is because the men from Britain arrive with their families, with their women, and there's not a need for mixing of other races or with the other people in North America. So they are considered purely white. In Spanish America, interestingly, before many Spanish women end up coming into the territory, let's back up here so we can talk about this. A lot of Spanish men ended up raping and taking indigenous Native American women and breeding with them. And these Indian women, we're talking about maybe number 4 here, these Indian women or indigenous people, indigenous women, Native American women, sometimes would try to find a Spanish man because that would help themselves rise in the ranks of the social hierarchy, and their children would perhaps be higher in that social hierarchy as well, as opposed to if they were to marry someone of their own race, should we call it, of say someone else who is Native American or African, they would be much lower on the social totem pole. So if a Spanish man was available, many times Native American women would try to find a Spanish man. And oftentimes, unfortunately, Spanish men would rape Native American women, and their children would be of a mixed race, a mestizo, so higher ranking than an indigenous person, if that Spanish man would claim the child. Anyways, back to New England colonies in North America. So again, they're pure white settler societies. They do not mix with the indigenous population, and women who are from Britain are very, very carefully guarded. Their men watch them carefully. They are kept indoors for the most part. They're not allowed to go outside unchaperoned because they need to be protected from Native Americans. And most of the British who come over into North America bring their Protestant traditions with them, their Protestantism, and there's a lot less attempt at converting the local population. They do not try to convert the Native Americans to Protestantism, whereas the Spanish are Catholic, and they definitely do try to convert the local population. Because of Protestants' philosophy that people should be able to read the Bible themselves and interpret it themselves, there's a lot of literacy amongst the British population in New England colonies because they want to be able to read the Bible. Even including women, because women will teach their children. There is weak royal control. What does that mean? The British monarchy, the royalty in England, don't have that much say in the Americas. They allow the North American colonies, the New England colonies, a lot of self-autonomy. They can rule themselves. They can control and create their own political systems in North America as long as taxes and tribute are being sent over to Britain. What ends up happening is the creation of trading companies or joint stock companies. And these are a few people who put in their money together to send someone or a family over to North America to create a settler community, and then maybe they will send back goods and other products to Britain. So they're basically like a joint stock company tries to give money to get more back in return later, and to put it in very simple terms. And so these trading companies have a lot of autonomy as well. And what's really interesting here is that the British military is backing these trading companies. And the British military will support all settler colonies and settlers in North America. So they're protected from not just Native Americans, but from Dutch and Spanish and French people as well, which is pretty impressive to think about. The British military is not one to mess with, and these private companies have the military to support them. That would sort of be like McDonald's in Japan having the US military to support them if anything went wrong, which is kind of crazy, but also makes a lot of sense. America has a history of supporting private companies in other countries, and this is sort of where it starts. Roanoke in Virginia is the first colony that was attempted to be created starting in 1585, and there are 3 pluses there because there were 3 more attempts, and all 4 attempts totally failed, and the people either went home or sort of just disappeared. Jamestown in 1607 was the first successful colony that ended up staying longer than a few years, and they were established, and that was the first British colony in America. I kind of like this map. It's an old map of the English Empire in America, and you can kind of see where this person's perspective was. On the right side, you have an angel holding the sign that talks about the British Empire, and there is a ship at the bottom, and very nice writing, and it's clear. And then on the left side, it looks very wild in a sense. There are animals and trees and rivers and Native Americans that are fighting, and you see bows and arrows, and you see people sitting around a table with a naked woman. Who knows what they're doing? Maybe they're going to try to eat her. At the bottom of the page, you see people who are perhaps naked, and someone's holding a knife, what it looks like to me. And you can kind of just really get a feel of the perspective that these people had on the Americas in general, on North America, and on the quote-unquote English Empire in America. So the right side, which has been taken over by British, is a little bit more refined, and on the left side, it's a little bit more wild. Okay, so the Portuguese, moving on to the Portugal Trading Post Empire, they create these little dots in the green territories that you see on this map, and they create what are called trading posts, which is a bunch of men who come to trade. They do not bring women with them. They do not bring anything aside from military to protect themselves and their products, and they bring goods to trade. And so this is what it looks like with where the Portuguese have control. And this is in the Indian Ocean territory right here around India, which is the Texas of the East, according to me, because it looks like Texas to me. So the Indian Ocean territory here and all the way around Africa, and of course in Brazil. And this begins around the 1500s. It doesn't last very long, but it's pretty powerful. The Portuguese become pretty powerful here for a few reasons. So the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean, they are economically weak, meaning the goods that they provide from Portugal are not of interest to the people in the East, in the Asian territories, in China, in India, etc. However, they have military strengths. They have cannons that are put on ships that go boom and can break stuff. And their ships are strong and powerful, and they end up creating naval bases along with those trading posts where they basically force trade with the East in the form of Cortez passes. They do not have goods to sell, but they do have military capacity to stop other people from doing trade without this pass. You have to buy this pass in order to do trade in the Indian Ocean. It's pretty interesting that it's almost free, meaning there aren't militaries that protect their own goods from China, from India, or from other parts of the Indian Ocean territory. So the Portuguese realize how kind of unprotected it is, so they go in there and they become the police force, and they force people to buy these Cortez passes. Eventually they realize that they can't sell anything of their own European creation, so they enter into what is called Asian trade. They buy goods from one part of Asia and they sell it to other parts of Asia. And they were kind of trying to buy stuff and send it back to Europe, but then they realized that the Asian trade was more lucrative. They made more money in that way. So they kind of stopped sending stuff back to Portugal for the most part and focused on Asian trade again with these Cortez passes. This Portuguese trading post empire declined over the years, and eventually after 1600 was replaced with other European powers. Okay, so the Spanish went to the Philippines and the Spice Islands. They were introduced to this territory by Magellan, who is a Portuguese sailor who worked for Spain, and from 1519 to 1521 he attempted to circumnavigate the globe, to sail around the world. And he was considered to be successful, even though he died. He was killed in a skirmish in the south part of the Philippines. He was given credit for it, even though one of his men ended up bringing the ships back to Spain. And so he introduced Europe to the Spice Islands, the extraordinary islands that grew things like clove and mace and nutmeg, which are delicious for cooking and for medicinal purposes. The Spanish, when they took over, it was considered easy rule. for 300 years, from 1565 till 1898. And it was considered easy for a few reasons. One, there was Catholic pageantry. The Catholics came in with their amazing processions and ceremonies and spices and beautiful clothing, and this was very attractive to the people. And of course, there are also stories of miracle working thanks to prayer and other Catholic traditions, and this was very, very attractive to the locals. There was also, of course, an extraordinary amount of oppression in the form of taxes, tribute, and labor, similar to what is seen in Spanish America, in the southern parts of America, in the Aztec territory and in the Incan territory. Taxes, tribute, and forced labor was forced upon the locals, and this led to revolts, but the locals, of course, had no chance of winning because the Spanish had things that the locals didn't, such as guns and steel swords. So the indigenous population tried to protect themselves and tried to revolt, but were always unsuccessful. Additionally, churches were created, and this decreased isolation from isolated villages to more local centers around churches, where villages and townships were built around a church. So this increased the connectivity between the people and the Catholics. And because of this, in addition, women's roles were reduced. They used to be healers and midwives and spiritual leaders, but churches, especially Catholic churches, are definitely patriarchal. Men rule, and therefore women's roles were greatly reduced at this time. There was resistance in a few ways. In Mindanao Island, for example, the Islamic traders had come into there, and many of the people had converted to Islam. So when the Catholic Spanish came in, they kind of used Islam as a uniting force, as an attempt to resist the Catholic overlords. In the Manila, which is a port city, there were a lot of Chinese who were enticed to come down, to come live and work there by the Spanish. The Spanish sort of invited the Chinese to come down because a lot of the locals died, and there wasn't enough local population, indigenous population in Manila to work on the plantations. So they encouraged Chinese people to move down there, and they did in fairly great numbers. About 20,000 Chinese people came down. But then the Chinese sort of stopped wanting to listen to the Spanish, and rather than compromising, they basically massacred all of them. About 20,000 people were killed in one occasion, as one example. So down here is Manila. These are the Philippine Islands, and Mindanao Island is down here. Up here is China. This is Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And these are Dutch territories, Dutch Sumatra and Dutch Java. We'll talk about that in a little while, but the Spanish controlled this territory. So in Asian commerce, the Europeans created what are called East India companies. The Dutch and the English in particular were really strong on these East India companies, and they are again joint stock companies, which are private trading monopolies. So private company that has a monopoly on a certain product. They are the only ones who can trade and grow and sell a particular product. And what's really interesting about this is that they can make war and have the support of the English military and the Dutch military, and they can govern the conquered people. Even though they are private trading companies, they are not representatives of the Dutch or English royalty. They are private companies. This is basically like McDonald's going into another country and saying, I'm going to make war and I'm going to govern the people here, and if I have any problems, the American military is going to come in to support me, to back me up. It's kind of insane to think about from our perspective today, but this is exactly how things were done. Why would the Dutch and English government support these private companies? Well, they get a lot of money in return. They get loans from these joint stock companies that are generally very wealthy. And countries like, or territories like the Dutch and English Empire, they like they like money and they want power, and so they work together in this way. The Dutch, these are people from the Netherlands in the northwest-ish part of Europe, sort of. The Netherlands, the Dutch brutally take a few territories, these Spice Islands, for example, and this is considered successful. And by 1624, they create monopolies on mace, nutmeg, and what's the other spice? Clove. And these Spice Islands are ruled by the Dutch, who rule in an extremely harsh manner. The local indigenous population suffers in degrees that we can't even fathom today. We'll talk about this a little bit more later on, but just think of the worst thing ever, and that's pretty much how the Dutch ruled there. In Taiwan, there was less success. And this is kind of interesting to think about the history here. The Dutch needed workers in Taiwan. They encouraged Chinese people to come down to work in Taiwan. Eventually, there were enough Chinese people in Taiwan that China took over by 1662, and the Dutch had to be removed from there. And this is when China officially took over the island nation of Taiwan. And today, there's still a big skirmish between these two territories. Taiwan considers itself and wants to be independent, and China is not interested in letting go. The British, or what is known as the English East India Company, the EEIC, they had to deal with the Mughal Empire. The Mughals, as you all know, are an Islamic empire controlling India, whose population is again mostly Hindu. You all know this already. I'm very excited. And the Mughals are introduced to, or excuse me, the British are introduced to India's cotton. And cotton from India is the best cotton ever, probably still today. And they do establish trading posts in the Mughal Empire, but they do so without force. They have to sort of beg the Mughal leadership to allow them to create trading posts, to allow them to come in and trade. So the British come into here without a lot of power, but eventually they end up influencing in an extraordinary way, and when the Mughal Empire falters and becomes less powerful and weakens over the years, the British are the ones who come in. So the British establish what is called a carrying trade, where they carry goods from India to other parts of Asia, similar to the Portuguese. And eventually they also end up carrying bulk commodities, things like tea and coffee and silk and pepper, and they end up selling this stuff to Europe and to other Asian countries, other Asian territories, not countries. And these trading posts, which again are just a place where military come to support trade, so it's merchants and their merchandise along with some armed guards, these trading posts end up becoming colonies, especially after the 1700s. So here we have in the orange, you can see territory under Portuguese control, and then the green in the Philippines under Spanish control, and the pink is territory under Dutch control. And all of the black dots are European trading posts that belong to different people, different European entities. This is an image of the spice trade. What do you see here? There are dark-skinned people of every age, and both men and women. And there are people with white hair. You can tell that they're older and they're hunched over. And women whose chest is uncovered. And they're working. This is supposed to be picking peppercorns, even though it sort of looks like blueberries. And then you see this white guy on the right side of the page, and he has a dagger, and he's dressed in European garb, and sort of, and he appears bigger than everybody else. His head is bigger, his face is bigger, Everything about him is bigger, and he's carrying a weapon. So it definitely goes to show that he is the one in charge here. And perhaps he's tasting the product, he's tasting the pepper to make sure that these people are doing their job. Definitely an interesting image of the spice trade. Okay, so we're going to talk about the East a little bit. We're going to introduce the East and how Europeans come into the territory. And we'll talk a lot more about this in the upcoming units, but I think it's important to remember what's going on across the globe at this time. So in China, with the Ming Dynasty, they consider themselves the most advanced country, nation in the world, people of the world. They are the center of the universe. Remember, north, south, east, west, and China. And all other people are barbarians. They are very insular, meaning protective. They create borders around themselves, literally the Great Wall of China, to protect from the Mongols up north. And they don't really travel into the wild, wild west, in the western region of China and beyond. And they create things like the Forbidden City to protect their most precious nobility and their ideas from anyone, including other Chinese people. In 1514, the Portuguese arrive in China, in a city called Macau. It's a port city. And eventually, by 1559, the emperor allows trade with the Portuguese. This is for a few reasons. The Chinese really like silver, and they want silver. And the Portuguese have silver, of course, eventually from the Americas is where they get their silver. And they also bring in Jesuit missionaries, for example, Matteo Ricci. And these Jesuit missionaries come in saying that they have knowledge of things like science. And that is interesting to the Chinese. They are not very interested in converting to another religion, to Christianity, but they do like the idea of learning about science and maps, and that's how these Jesuit missionaries make their way in. Overall, there's a very, very, very small number of converts, maybe 200,000 to 300,000 people, but when we're talking about a population of 300 million people, we're talking 0.001% of the population. And then these Christians are removed, the Portuguese are removed, because of a few reasons. The Chinese have an extremely strong economy in the 1500s. They don't need stuff from outside of China. They are very politically organized. They have a very strong administrative system, a very strong military, and they just are very powerful. And their culture is very strong. They have Confucian philosophy, they have Buddhism, they have Taoism, they have all the religious and spiritual needs fulfilled already. They do not need anyone Christian coming in here to try to influence them. So eventually these missionaries and Christians and Portuguese are removed. In Japan, there are lots of influences from China, especially Buddhism and Confucianism. Of course, the Japanese interpret this their own way and have their own influences on these religious philosophies, but they are able to pick and choose from China, perhaps because they are an island nation and China doesn't have the ability to exert as much control on Japan as they do on other territories in the East, like, for example, the Koreas, North and South Korea today. The social structure, political structure of Japan starts with an emperor on top, and then there are what are called daimyo, which are basically powerful lords who have territory, and in that region they have samurai who are military to protect them, and eventually there's a shogun. One of the daimyo ends up taking power and conquering the others, the other territories, the other daimyo, and that is the Tokugawa clan, the Tokugawa shogunate. The Tokugawa shogunate ruled for what is considered to be a 250-year period of a peaceful state. Of course, there wasn't total peace within Japan. However, it was better than having lots of little civil wars between the different daimyo clans. The Tokugawa shogunate was able to lead because they had a lot of silver from within Japan, and they bought Portuguese guns from the Portuguese starting around 1453. They copied the guns and then they banned them, which is kind of interesting because the Tokugawa clan had guns and then they banned them from the rest of the population. They said things like, if you don't use a sword and you are a samurai, that is a wimpy way of doing things, and that is not how a proper samurai should behave. So it was sort of it was a ban, but it was also a social stigmatism to use a gun. Of course, they kept the gun, so that helped them keep their power. They also ended up banning Christianity and all Christians except for the Dutch in one port city. And the Dutch weren't interested in proselytizing. They didn't try to convert the Japanese to Christianity, so they were allowed to trade in one port one time a year. When we are talking about silver in global commerce, silver and how it affected the world from the 16th through the 17th centuries, that's the 1500s through the 1600s, it all starts in the Americas for the most part. There is silver in other parts of the world, like Japan has their own silver stash in their mountains there, but in the Americas, there is a lot of silver. In Potosi, which are in the Andes region in modern-day Bolivia, which is just sort of south-ish of Peru, between Peru and Brazil, south of that territory there, the Spanish in Potosi come in and force the locals, the indigenous population, to mine for them. And mines today are still considered to be pretty unsafe. Recently, a few years ago, a mine collapsed and trapped a whole bunch of people inside, and we have modern technology today. At the time, the conditions were so terrible for the miners, which were, of course, native slaves, that when a local indigenous person was drafted to go work in the mine for the Spanish, their families held funerals for them before they left because they knew there was a very small chance of them returning alive. That's how bad the conditions were for the miners. In addition to great dangers, there were great abuses by the Spanish conquistadors, by the conquerors in the territory, and very few survived, and the ones who did survive had major physical challenges for the rest of their lives. And also, of course, mining leads to major environmental degradation. When you mine, you cut down trees, and then you remove topsoil, and you dig into mountains. That creates toxic waste and pollution for rivers and air, and the environment suffered tremendously, as did the local indigenous population. In China, the government there decided that silver would be needed to pay taxes. Rather than paying taxes in a commodity like rice that someone would grow, instead the government decided that people would have to pay their taxes in the form of silver. So they would sell their foodstuffs that they grew for silver in order to be able to pay their taxes. And this led to cash crops. They're called cash crops because they literally are sold for cash. Crops are sold for cash in order to pay for things. Kind of like we do today. You don't go to the market with a bag of rice on your back to trade for other goods. You bring money and then you buy the goods that you want. But cash crops ended up leading to deforestation. Forests are cut down to create vast fields of a product to grow and then to sell. Because if a family is now growing one product, they need a lot of it to sell in order to pay for their taxes and in order to make enough money to pay for the other foods that they need to sustain themselves. China and India outproduce Europe in a lot of products, mainly silk and cotton. China produces great silk and India produces wonderful cotton for textiles, and they outproduce Europe, and Europeans want to pay for this stuff and they need silver. And where does that silver come from? The Americas. So here is, and then in Japan, we'll talk more about that in a second. In Japan, the Tokugawa shogunate, they ended up, as we mentioned a moment ago, defeating the other feudal lords, the other daimyo clans, and ruling. They ended up uniting Japan because of this, and similar to China, they closed their borders to outsiders, except for, again, the Dutch once a year. But the Japanese have great economic growth, and that's for a lot of reasons. One, they have a lower birth rate. They prevent people from having more than one or two kids in a few ways. Some of the ways are better than others. They create birth control, and they promote baby infanticide, where they kill babies, and they get married at older ages. And when you're older, you generally have less kids than when you're very young and can pop out a bunch of babies. And so that was helpful for economic growth because there's a smaller population using up the supplies that they had. They also protected agriculture and planted forests. And this is kind of interesting because they ensure that the environment is in some ways protected by growing forests. They plant trees, and they protect agriculture to allow the people to eat well and to sell a lot of products. So here's how the kind of circle of silver goes. American silver, as in silver that comes from the Americas, from, say, Potosi in Bolivia, modern day South America, middle sort of of the South America, ended up going to Spain, and from Spain ended up going to Manila, which is south of China, and from there it went to China, where taxes were paid in silver. Within Spain, there was so much silver because they were stealing so much silver from the local native population in the Americas that it led to inflation. Inflation means that the price of silver loses its value. So say you pay 1 silver coin for a loaf of bread. In a few days or a year, you have to pay 2 silver coins for the same loaf of bread, and then maybe a year later you have to pay 3 silver coins. So the value of the silver is reduced, and you need a lot more of it in order to pay for the same stuff. The inflation, plus the fact that the Spanish were very unwelcoming to outsiders, to foreigners, led to Spain's downfall in the long term. By the end of the 17th century, the Spanish were no longer the superpower of Europe or the world. And here's a map of that. We've got Spanish-controlled Potosi in Bolivia today, down here on the left in South America. And it went to Spain, up here in the Iberian Peninsula. And from here, the Spanish went down to Manila in the Philippines, and from there it went into China, where it was paid, where it was used to pay taxes and to trade with China. Because again, China has a lot of really wonderful things, and the Chinese are not interested in anything from Europe except for really silver. Silver is the only thing that the Chinese really want. So furs, moving on to furs. Furs in global commerce. Again, furs are considered soft gold because they are so valuable. And that's because of a few reasons. The sources of furs are from North America and from Siberia, which is the northeast part of Russia. And there was a huge increase in demand for these soft gold furs. The European population growth after the Black Plague ended up leading more people to need means of staying warm. They didn't have electricity and heaters. And there was a little ice age, or a mini ice age, in a lot of parts of Europe. And with an increase in population and the temperatures cooling to a pretty severe degree, people needed more furs. Plus the Chinese liked furs, plus the Ottomans needed furs. And so the demand for furs was greatly increased over a few 100-year period. In America, the furs were traded by Native Americans for European goods. Europeans came and said, we need furs, and we will give you things like pots and pans and tools that the Native Americans were unable to make. Unfortunately, with those goods came a few other things, including alcohol. Today, Native Americans suffer from one of the highest degrees of alcoholism in the country. Additionally, diseases came along with the Europeans, as we have already discussed, like smallpox and this ended up decimating a huge chunk of the Native American population. And lastly, there were tribal rivalries. Native American tribes ended up fighting against each other to hunt more furs so that they could attain more European goods so that they could become more powerful than their other rival tribes. And then lastly, the goods that the Europeans brought created a dependency upon the Native Americans who could not create these goods for themselves. So it kind of reduced the local indigenous culture. Women's roles were reduced because women used to create tools and use animals in lots of different ways rather than just for furs. So women's roles were reduced, and native culture was reduced because it was replaced with European goods. And then in the Siberian territory, when Russians came in to take over, they decided to tax the Siberians in furs. And the problem with this is that the Russians were also hunters. So they created competition for the Siberians who had to provide furs in the form of taxes. And if the Siberians did not provide enough furs, then hostages were taken from their families, like their children or wives or someone would be taken as a hostage until the proper number of furs was provided to their Russian overlords. And similar to in Native American territories, the Russians brought diseases that decimated the Siberian population. So that I think between Native Americans and Siberians, the Siberians had it worse because they weren't just trading, they were being taxed, they were being forced to provide furs. And of course, the environment falters. There were some breeds of animals that were almost hunted to extinction in both Siberia and in North America. And again, the local indigenous traditions were replaced by European philosophies and goods and ideas, which was sad for a lot of people. And women's roles were again reduced. Here you can see kind of the paths in North America where furs were hunted and where they were sent to Paris, to London, to St. Louis, to Montreal and London, from the north parts of North America and from modern-day Canada. Just a couple pictures we'll look at here. This one is called Tea and Porcelain in Europe. Tea, of course, comes from India. Porcelain, where does that come from? China. And we see here two European people drinking tea out of this porcelain, which is, I think, pretty ironic and interesting of a situation. I don't know if the guy to the right is her partner or a child. I really can't tell. It's kind of an interesting image, though. And it's a painting behind it, and it's a real a photograph of porcelain in front. And then this is called a chocolate party in Spain. Well, chocolate comes from cocoa beans, which comes from the Americas. They are drinking out of cups that look like porcelain, which are from China. And it is probably sweetened chocolate, and the sugar comes from the Muslims. So we definitely see a globalized world in both of these images where people are coming together and goods and ideas are coming together from all parts of the world at this point in time. And we're talking 500 years ago, which is pretty magnificent to think about. Okay, so we just finished talking about part A of Unit 3. And the next two parts, we're going to discuss early modern globalization and the slave trade, and we'll have a great discussion on primary sources on slavery. So enjoy those readings. They are pretty wild.